Good afternoon. Welcome. It's Tuesday noon, New York time. I'm so happy to see many familiar faces, new friends who join us for this important conversation today. I also see many others joining online from New York, but also around the world. Welcome. My name is Qing Gao. I'm a professor at Columbia School of Social Work, where I also serve as the Associate Dean for Doctoral Education. I'm a professor at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, which is hosting today's event. At Columbia, I also serve as the acting director of the Asian American Initiative. I think all my roles come together because today's conversation will touch upon many of those topics. Today's event is part of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute's series called Asia in Action. It's a series that highlights work of groundbreaking professionals, writers, designers, artists, influencers that we have today. So welcome to this wonderful conversation we are going to engage in. I'm honored to have our guest speaker, Qing Wang, Wang Qing in Chinese, co-founder and co-host of the Weirdo Podcast, 不合时宜, to be here today with us. She's also a fellow at the Asia Society this year. I cannot wait to engage in a conversation with you, Qing. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Gao. And also thank you so much for everyone who come in a busy Tuesday noon, especially grateful to our non-Chinese friends who show up here. It takes some real courage. And I've known Professor Gao since last year, and we've been talking about all kinds of different issues, both professionally and privately. So I'm really grateful to have this chance to be here today, not just to share my own experiences, but also to share, I think, an important trend that is happening in China now, which is the rise of independent podcasting, and being able to talk about independent podcasting in Columbia University is like the wildest dream comes true. So thank you.
Thank you, Qing. So all of us here, both in person and online, probably listen to some podcasts. Podcasting has become an important form of media, offering intimate yet public spaces for storytelling, emotional exchange, and shared reflection. I think today we are not doing a podcast, but it's a form of dialogue that will be deep, emotional, and hopefully stimulate some conversation with the audience members. For those who are joining online, feel free to enter your comments and questions into the Q&A box along the way, and we will turn to your questions later. So today's conversation will be a conversation. I will pose questions to Qing, and we will have a dialogue. So let me start from the very beginning. Your podcast, the Weirdo Podcast, which is so powerful and so popular, especially among the young people. I know you have over 1 million followers. When I talk to my other friends who also do podcasts, they said, how did this amazing person accumulate over 1 million followers? So can you bring us to the very beginning? How did you have this idea? And if someone asks you, what's your podcast about? How would you describe it?
That's a very good, simple but difficult question. I would say. So, the podcast called the Weirdo Podcast is a project that I co-started with two other journalist friends at the end of 2019, and so now we just celebrated our 6 years anniversary and I know the name is kind of puzzling because some of my friends, especially my English native speaker friends, would tell me, hey Qing, if you call your podcast as the Weirdo Podcast, it's really difficult to take you seriously. But actually, we are a quite serious podcast, sometimes even being criticized as too serious. And so we basically cover, if I have to summarize, that everything that concerns nowadays Chinese young people, from current affair, cultural phenomena, lifestyle, feminism, social justice, globalization, everything. And that makes us a very broad podcast on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think there is some sort of like topic characteristics in there, which is we deeply care about what is actually happening and what is actually on people's mind. And now we are entering this seventh years of our podcast. I would say I am more and more aware of another nature of our podcast, which is I would say we are a podcast about agency. So it's about agency of people. It's about almost all our episodes are about like people living in difficult circumstances, both like politically or socially or emotionally. It doesn't always happen. It's not just about China. It's also about like things and people that are outside of China. And we want to take a seat. Please take the front row. Don't be shy. Um, so um, um, so I think having that realization also sort of like broaden my own understanding of what podcast is actually about. I think it's a medium that connects, the private and the public, connects like people's own experience and what is actually happening in the world. And coming back to the name, the weirdo, I think having that realization also echoes with the reason that why we chose the weirdo as our name at the first place. It was actually quite intentional. So we feel that nowadays, even if one would identify themselves as the most mainstream person, if there's some person existing like that, even the most mainstream person would have moments in life that they feel they are weird. They are the weirdo in a community, in a society, and they want to think about things or understand the world, connect with people in a way that is non-conformist, that is not always fitting in the mainstream narrative, and that is weird. And also, I think by self-claiming us as the weirdo, we are also questioning, the definition of normality. What is normal, what is weird, who gets to define, and how do we find our own agency in the process of defining? And yeah, I think I will stop here.
This is so powerful. I love your name, the name of the podcast, both the English, the weirdo, because instantly I felt that's me. Even though by worldly standards, I could be a very successful mainstream scholar or professor, but it just touches my heart because I feel that captures my spirit. Also, the Chinese name, 不合时宜, oh my goodness. I love it too. These times where we have to follow a certain narrative, we have to just 合时宜, be the mainstream. What a powerful counter narrative. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Chinese name in that same spirit, or did you intend to cover that in your response just now already?
Oh, yeah, maybe very briefly, since we have so many Chinese faces here today. So the Chinese name is called like 不合时宜, and literally meaning out of sync with times or out of steps or sort of like unfitted. And we came up with that name. Actually, there was an interesting story behind that name, because like the moment when I and the two other journalist friends wanted to have this podcast, we actually had a list of 50 names. And then we had to sort of like pick one from out of the 50 names. And then finally we found this one. Oh, it actually really spoke to us. And also there was a joke among like that wave of Chinese podcasting that they tend to have name with 4 characters. Because in China, in Chinese, in the 成语, like the idiom is normally with like 4 characters. So I think maybe the 4 characters name somehow rhyme. It's still like a mystery, like within the Chinese podcast group, we often joke, oh, now you're having a new podcast. Please don't have it like a 4 characters name anymore, because like we already have so many. But it was part of that trend, the name. And for me personally, I just like the sound of the name, and also maybe some of you, if you're close enough to the table, you could see like I have some of our merch here, and the character that is printed on the cap is Bu, and I just like the simple and very determined voices, the tone in characters like this.
Wonderful. Thank you. I have to say later during the Q&A, if you raise a question, you can get one of the beautiful hats.
Thank you.
Stay tuned.
Yeah. Stay till the end.
So Qing, you brought us back a little bit to the very beginning of the launching, the ideation of this podcast. Do you mind talking about it? How did you and your co-founders initially had the idea, and what triggered you to actually take action to make it happen? And what was that early stage like?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That also brought me back to what happened in 2019. So I started as a journalist. I started as a journalist for institutional media, legacy media. I have worked for a few legacy media in China, both reporting on domestic affairs, like for the Southern Weekly for a while, Nanfang Zhoumo, and later on I became the international reporter, international affairs reporters for 界面新闻, so 界面 News, a financial news outlet based in Shanghai. And back to 2019, I was still working like a full time for a legacy media, but I started feeling that the trend that was happening inside the legacy media, like it was not going well. And it was not going well for a few reasons. On the one hand, I think for obvious reason, like censorship is a big thing in China, and commercially speaking, they also like start losing their momentum because the rise of social media like WeChat and different digital tech companies, platforms that start taking away their ad revenue. So it became harder and harder for the traditional newsroom to hire talents. And then I also start feeling there was a change in terms of information consumption. Taking myself as an example, in the past, if I wanted to read news or get reliable source of information, my default would be, I'm gonna look at those like legacy media. But I think in 2019, I start feeling like I myself like open the tabs of legacy media like less and less. And given I was a journalist around that time, I found that realization quite like shocking in a way, because and I realized I start receiving or being exposed to news more and more through other channels, and then I realized compared to like legacy media, which one or a few well-established news entity inform you about something, as an organization, compared to that kind of, storytelling, I myself become more and more interested in people with real name, real identity, real face, someone I trust, someone who has a very concrete face speaking to me instead of an abstract news organization. So I start feeling that tension, and also around that time, 2019, I also start like listening to English podcasts a lot, and then I realized there was a gap because around that time in the Chinese world, the podcasting wasn't a thing yet. There were a few people who were doing podcasting before that period, but it remained kind of like small scale. Like one of my friends sitting here, Ling Yao, he had that amazing podcast called Xuan Mei, I think starting from like 2015, centered around the American election around that time. And so that was like also one of my earlier inspire of the Chinese podcasting. And so all that reason like led to there was some sort of a doubt of whether there's like traditional journalism whether it's like whether was it like decline. Obviously it was in decline, but I was still half in that industry, and then I started wanting to find some other way of both like informing or connecting with my audiences, but also more creative way to express myself. And then I met my co-host and my two other co-hosts, and we had a few discussions, and then we decided just to launch it at the end of 2019.
Wow. Amazing story. Thank you for sharing. I think it also makes me think about the global trend, how we consume news, how we get information. And I think there's this hunger for human connection everywhere. I think you captured it so well, both to meet and talk to real people with real faces. But the second part you mentioned, express yourself. That's also very important. So I appreciate that very much. When you and your co-founders got together, did you have a vision? So often when we start something, we have a vision, we have a mission. This is what we are going to do. We are going to change the world. So did you have something like that? And how did it evolve over these 7 years?
Yeah, that's also, there was also a very interesting story about that. So the first episode we launched, it's literally named, let's see if we can reach 100 episodes. Because we felt we wouldn't be able to do that. So we just said it as a joke. One day we're gonna make till 100 episodes. But now we have published 280 episodes. And so it's like the work of the last 6 years. So I think at the beginning, when we launched the podcast, we didn't actually have that big of vision. We just felt the urgency of just doing something, and plus that podcast as a media project it isn't something that is so costly. So we felt we could afford, and the equipment was easy, and we get some help with the production. So everything felt kind of like a it's like I see a lot of maybe have students here today, and it's like a student project. We were just studying, doing our work, and then on the side we each spend some hours every week to do that. However, what happened after a few months after took us on a different turn. So the first episode was released in November 2019, and 3 months later, we reached our first milestone. We reached like 10,000 subscribers, and that happened thanks to or due to the COVID pandemic. And I remember it was in the end of January in 2020. Wuhan, the outbreak in Wuhan happened, and the whole China and eventually the whole world sort of got into a huge chaos. And so what happened in Wuhan and eventually also in some neighboring provinces led to partial lockdown or full lockdown in a lot of provinces, and then the world didn't recover from that. I would say even until today, like, the research you are conducting is to have a more comprehensive understanding of the implication of that global event. And for me, for our small podcast around that time, we just like out of intuition, we just start like publishing a lot of things that now we look back, you probably know that, well thought, but around that time, getting it out there on time, and even it was taken down later on, it meant a lot. And so then we start like creating episodes to share the information and to also to connect people, what happens well, and what can you do in certain situation, getting doctor on the podcast and getting volunteers who were helping on the podcast. And it was, I think, out of some sort of a journalistic instinct. It was like none of them was perfect. It was like poorly recorded, poorly produced, but I think that was the first surge of building our podcast as a channel to link people, but also more than being a media project, it became a platform to connect people who all of a sudden in an extreme situation start feeling lonely, alienated, and wanted information, wanted to connect. I would say, yeah, that was like the first phase of our podcast. And the first milestone was always difficult. And I would say reaching that, 10,000 subscribers was actually harder than, all the things later on, because after that, it just, you get a ball rolling and then you start being a part of the ecosystem. So that actually not that difficult anymore, because you know where you are, you know your position. But the first one was, yeah, it happened that way. I hate to say it, but our podcast did, like, quote unquote, benefit from the first wave of the pandemic.
Wow, that's so powerful. I didn't anticipate this story, but it is powerful, and it reflects the times, right? Your initial wish to connect people, to help people find agency. It's really showcased during this pandemic where people were isolated under lockdown, but then you played a big role in connecting them, sharing information. It feels like it's the journalistic responsibility there, but through this podcast.
Yeah, I want to add one note there, because around that time I was still working for the legacy media I was working for. I tried to report about, things on COVID. I couldn't get like approval from my editor because it was just too risky. But podcast around that time was considered something, small and trivial, and we don't care that much, and there wasn't heavy censorship applied to podcasts as a medium. So then we were kind of free to do whatever, not literally whatever, but I mean, a lot of the things that were not possible to be published on legacy media in China were possible in podcasts. And well, of course, nowadays, like, the censorship on podcasts start sort of like catching up, but around that time, it was really, it was really a sort of an in between place that could connect specific kind of people.
Yeah, amazing. Let's move forward a little bit in this journey, 6+ years. So that was the initial stage, and congratulations on breaking through to that 10K plus subscribers. That's amazing. And I think that really says a lot, especially to the young people. But I feel to me too, just be brave, and you have an idea, you just act on it. You don't know what will happen until you act on it. So that's a very powerful lesson there.
Thank you.
So if we move until today, then look back on this journey of 6+ years. There are probably phases, there are milestones in your podcasting career. Can you tell us a bit about the evolvement and maybe highlight a few themes that emerged in that process that really, people think of the Weirdo Podcast, they think of these particular themes.
Yeah, I think for the as a media, 6 years is still like quite short, but for us, for me and my co-host and my team, it's been really a journey. And I think it was actually during the pandemic year we became from a sort of amateur group of people just like doing podcasting to somehow a little bit more established and start having team and start having role divisions. And I remember one of the peak moment was somewhere at the end of like 2022, and I think it was around that moment we felt still like quite like pretty much related to the pandemic or the end of the pandemic, that what we actually want to do or what kind of power this podcast has and how should we carry it on. And I will start with the theme. I think one of the theme that emerged like kind of naturally in our podcast was feminism. And so when I look back, what happened during the pandemic year, one thing that really one thing that I became more aware than ever is the existence of the let's say the marketplace of ideas in China. Because I think nowadays when talking about China or the ideas in China, the intellectual life in China, in the English world, there's a common impression that China is getting more and more controlled or tightened and closed off, which can be true on the one hand, but on the other hand, still a lot of things are happening and people are still exchanging idea, having discussions, taking actions in very in small scale, but collectively become larger scales. And that is like my experience of running this podcast for the last 6 years, which is there's always a hunger or appetite for deep conversation in the Chinese sphere, even if a lot of them are fluent in English. Being able to use your mother tongue to discuss like deep issues are a core need, a core intellectual need, but also a core emotional need. And so coming back to this feminism theme, I think feminism is a core theme of our podcast. It doesn't cover everything. We also talk about other topics as well, and but like feminism had sort of like emerged in China at the same time as we were starting out our podcast. I think in one of our earlier conversation, we both like sort of recall, the experience of being women, growing up in China, and how we eventually, got here. And I realized my own feminism awakening has started very late. Um, it if I recall, I think the real awakening moment for me was actually in 2018 when the Me Too movement happened, and first thing here in the U.S. and China was also there was some cases in China too, and looking back, I was quite surprised about that realization because, as someone, I identify myself as, I like reading books, I like watching movies, I like intellectual stuff. But how come that I wasn't introduced to feminism, or feminism didn't find me all these years before late 2018? Because at the 2018, I was already in my late 20s. And then I realized it has something to do with the kind of books we have in China. So for a long time, I think the books that are being translated or introduced from foreign language to Chinese were largely dominated by male intellectuals. And even if those like self-claimed liberal or progressive male intellectuals from China somehow they introduced and translated everything from democracy, freedom of speech, or modernity, but intentionally left out feminism. And I felt when I became like aware of that, I felt I shared this experience with some other like females also like from same background, same faces. We share the same kind of feeling that how come like we are grew up in China and wanting to be a progressive world citizen, and then we were not that exposed to feminism related like works, and because of that, sort of consciously or unconsciously chose a choice of translating among the male intellectuals. I think later on when the whole Me Too scandal broke out, we were like surprisingly we found out, oh, actually many of those figures and even those who actually have a strong standing point in the intellectual sphere in China are their gender awareness like are so poor, and even some of them were even being accused of being harasser or abuser like sexually, and many of them refuse to acknowledge that. And that actually comes to another momentum of our podcast. So my co-host, who's now in Europe, and we're in a similar age and going through similar phases of life, like she actually herself like personally experienced a quite unpleasant harassment when she was at a university, and one of her professor, not from that university but from a different school, harassed her, and when she was a undergraduate, and she managed to escape, but then that trauma stayed with her ever since. So in one of the episodes, she decided to speak out and told our audience what happened many years ago, and then we published that episode. And of course, after the episode published, for some reason, it immediately caused a debate, because like that teacher who harassed her around that time, by the moment when the episode got released, he was a sort of like a big name in the in China, especially in the civil society field, and he was attached to so many major institutions, and then he unsurprisingly threatened to sue us, and that of course was a very unpleasant experience, and then later on we start receiving more and more stories from women with similar experience who all had unpleasant encounter with that teacher and came to us. In the end, that whole move sort of like shifted things around, and that teacher had to resign from a lot of institutions he was attached to, and like a lot of the Me Too stories we nowadays are very familiar with, but that one was like our story, the story of my co-host, my dear friend, and it was from that moment I start realizing, okay, we got to take this seriously. We are powerful, and we have power, but we need to be like cautious about it, and we need to like fight for it. And it's just so important to have a channel, to have a place for us, and also for women, young people, especially young women who have suffered from these experiences, to have a place to gather, to voice their opinions, and to tell their stories. Yeah. Sorry, it was a little lengthy, but sharing this took me sort of back to that moment when I recorded that podcast with her. It was in 2020.
This another super powerful moment and personal. I think as a woman, and as many women who are listening to you today, when you describe all this, I think we have flashbacks of all kinds of encounters, big and small, that we personally experienced. And they don't get to be shared. They don't get to be told. And justice don't get to be brought about. So I just applaud you and your co-founder for the courage, and then for giving people this opportunity to connect, to share, and to feel powerful, to feel they have agency. It's amazing. It's amazing. Here's the power to independent podcasting. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel we also like lucky to be part of the trend, like two trends here. One is like the feminism awakening movement in China. I feel like of course it's like it's still very complicated. It's not all like all that straightforward, but a lot of things are happening in this marketplace of ideas in China. I think the feminism related discussions, despite all the restriction it might still be having, it is still one of the domain that get discussed a lot. And the whole phase, the personal is political is so powerful, and I think that's also one of the principles of what we do at the podcast. And another trend is really the rise of the independent podcasting. Before today's event, I was checking the data point of the global podcasting market and the Chinese one, and realizing, okay, China actually now, according to some reports, there is like 150 million podcast listener, and I mean that's like the half of the population of the whole EU, and it's like very powerful. And I think globally, audience size is around maybe 600 million or something. So China is like 1/4 of that. And I think China is becoming or is already the largest like podcast listening market. And so even if, I keep saying that, it's a small media project, but the potential is actually getting quite big, and a lot of people are doing a lot of different things with this medium right now.
Very powerful. I agree. And if I didn't know before today, now I know. So it's amazing. I want to turn the question a little bit to your audience members. So you probably have a sense of who your listeners are, demographically, how they feel about things, what their views are. So maybe describe to us who your audiences are and whether their feedback, their suggestions, whether they provide some kind of guidance or feedback for you so that that shapes your podcasting practice.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think for the first one, so the demographic profiles of our audiences, I think it's actually quite similar to the global podcast listener. I feel like maybe factual points, they are mostly between like 20 to 40-year-old, likely young people, and with the university education. Some of them are with like master degree and living in first tier or second tier city. And so comparatively speaking, as the sort of like the middle class, like in a society. And I think both, and that is generally also the profile of podcast audiences in China and globally. So you see this kind of a shared feature. And the other day I was talking to a friend who's running an English language podcast, and he received a sponsorship from a online therapy platform called BetterHelp. I think BetterHelp wanted to sort of like sponsor his podcast or collaborated with his podcast. And so I shared a similar experience because our podcast was so approached by the Chinese equivalent of BetterHelp in China. And so then we had a realization on that time, maybe, the podcast listening group are also the target group of the psychotherapy group, and, people who are curious about the world, who are interested in like self-learning, self-helping, and so that is one thing. And I think for our podcast, there's something slightly different, which is like we have slightly more female listener than male listener, and like that is not a surprise. And we have audiences both inside China and outside China, because me and my co-host were both outside of China now, so we also talk a very wide range of what is going on in the world. And I think that made our audiences slightly more, like we have more overseas listeners than most of the podcasts in China. I think it's like 70% of them are from mainland China and the 30% from outside of China. And then I found there is also some sort of like, let's say, shout like interest or like tension in our audiences, maybe because I blame the name that attract like people who like to think a lot, like 想太多, like that kind of people, and who are open-minded and international-minded, and sometimes I joked, it's imagine the Guardian reader profile, but coming from China. Of course, it's a little bit like simplified, but I think that's like how, like from the factual perspective, I understand who my audiences are. And in terms of the interaction with our audiences, I would say, coming from the background that I have, like being a journalist trained in legacy media, like doing podcasts, like the biggest mental shift for me from being a traditional journalist to a podcast is that I now think a lot about the relation between me and my audiences. When I was working just for legacy media, I don't like that's the job of my boss. It was not my job. My job was just like to do a story well and get it published. And now that like things running this podcast, that question is always there. You know, who are they? Who they want and what you can offer, and it's not always the same. And sometimes they want something that are very important for their daily life, but then it's not something we can offer. And so you need to sort of like find a middle ground in those points, like, you know, who your audiences are and what they want, and then what you can offer. And it's also about like testing and revising all the time. Sometimes and I realized this like podcasting app called 小宇宙, so Little Universe, and they provide so they have the feature, they spend a lot of effort in creating the comment session, which is like really helpful for podcaster to receive feedback, because you then can understand in a quite like immediate way of what make them tick and what make them upset. And also important to note that reading a comment session, using it as a channel to get feedback, but only up to a point, because being a podcaster, exposing yourself out there, also I think it poses a lot of risk for you know, people don't like your content, people don't like this point you make, and there is like definitely kind of like parasocial relationship between podcasts and the audiences, that you've never met them, but they consider knowing you at a very deep level. Because one of the very shocking anecdote I heard from one of the podcast listeners is that he told me that he listened to our podcast while he was taking shower. And then I immediately feel, oh, like that's too much information. I don't know how to, you know, describe this relationship anymore. But overall, I think we benefited from the feedback we received from the audiences, and that helped us to be more aware and more mindful of what we are talking about. And it also offers us a lens of who the audiences are.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I have only 2 more questions. Then we will turn to the audience members for the Q&A. If you wouldn't mind taking us to behind the scenes, the business side of your podcast, right? You have to run it, you have to sustain it, and you have the beautiful merchandise, which I love. So can you talk about how you run it as a business to some extent? Thank you.
I will say, like, for our podcast right now, we aren't a commercially successful podcast. Both me and my co-host, we have other jobs, we have other gigs, and that removes the sort of like the financial pressure of having to profit from this podcast. And in the last 6 years, we have had period why we try to like put more effort and focus on the podcast, but eventually we now realize, for the kind of life we want to live, and that it is important for us to actually just treat the podcast as something that it can, as long as it can stand on its own feet, then we are happy about it. And our vision with the podcast is that we want to run it for maybe the coming 10 years, 15 years. We want to take some sort of like the vision of a long-termism, 长期主义 kind of perspective. And so that there will always be a podcast like this in the Sinophone sphere. But I can talk a little bit about the overall right now how podcasts make money in China. Basically, there are I would say maybe 3 models. One is to get like sponsorship. So the corporates clients, they want to reach out to certain sort of audiences, and podcast audiences are considered as engaging and with some sort of like purchasing power because they are better educated, so they are considered as a group of consumers that are quite valuable. And so corporates, especially corporates who care about like telling a more in a modern version of their stories, would like to reach out to podcast to do sponsorship. And the second one is let's say paid like the like payment from the audiences. Like it can be paid content, so you can, like right now all our podcasts are for free, so you can just listen without paying. But there are also like podcasts that decide to go full behind the paywall or to have certain episode behind the paywall. And then you can also have like some sort of a membership program for the podcast audiences to be a part of the community. And that's like then you can for instance have like events or like sell merch, and you could provide like specific also like services to the audience. Like I know some podcasts will just go grab coffee with their audiences, and we try for a little while we try to go to that direction, but then I realized like actually for me, I am. This has something to do with my personality, and I'm actually a very introvert person. So when talking in front of a microphone, making a podcast or having an event, a conversation, is something easy for me, or it's something that do not cost too much energy. But when it comes to in a more like spontaneously socializing environment, it actually takes a lot of energy out of me. And so this comes back to the point, the personal is political. I realize in this whole business, because the podcast is it's I would say it's a field. A lot of like small teams are running on a very small scale. So the personalities were like the preferences of the co-hosts, of the founders, actually really mattered. And I think these are the things that are kind of like the defining factor to decide whether a podcast is successful or not, is likable or not. And so right now with my team, we only have me and my co-host and one producer who is in charge of like overlooking all the production side, and one like part-time designer who is taking care of the visual part. And that is how small it is. And this is also sometimes when my friends who are interested in having podcasts, running our own podcast, approach me and saying, "Oh, hey Qing, I want to start my own podcast. Do you have some advice?" And my advice is always, then the one and only advice is to start it now, because it's really not that complicated.
Wonderful. I know you've given me that advice. I haven't acted on it. So maybe today will be the moment to push me further. My final question is, if you could go a little bit introspective to think about your journey, right? We talked about this coming from a relatively small place within China, and then you moved to Europe. Now you're in the US, and you're a fellow at Asia Society. So can you share with us about, okay, maybe what does this journey mean for you? What would be a takeaway? And then what's in front of you as a fellow at Asia Society and for your podcast?
Yeah, thank you so much for putting that question. The fellowship I'm doing with Asia Society, Asia Society is a non-for-profit based in New York and has like global branch, and that has played as an important role in connecting Asia and the West. And the fellowship I want to do there, I'm already doing there, in short, is to basically to, I think, help the English-speaking world understand China better, and actually nowadays China, everyday Chinese people's life. I feel right now, if we look at all the things we saw from the news headline, mainstream media, the reporting about China are still quite narrowed, and you often see reports about about geopolitics, China-US rivalry, or economic power, military tension, and all this like big important thing. Do they matter? Of course, they matter a great deal. But is that what on demand of everyday Chinese people? I would say no. And China's big, and China is a lot. And by doing this, what I want to do is to basically present or describe a kind of like China beyond headline. Like in particular, what I will be doing is I have an attachment with the Asia Society in Switzerland, thanks to the generosity from the Money Museum in Zurich. We're now doing this like China and World Fellowship, in which I will curate and introduce what is happening in the conversation of a Chinese podcasting world to an English audiences. And I think podcasts can serve as a very interesting medium to understand like nowadays Chinese people's mentality. I was joking with a friend the other day that if you want to understand what young people in Paris talk about in early 20th century, you're probably gonna read in Ernest Hemingway or Marcel Proust or this kind of people. And if you want to understand what the young people in America talk about in late 20th century, the end of 20th century, you're probably gonna watch TV series like Friends or Sex and the City. But if you want to understand Chinese young people during and after the COVID pandemic in China, what are they thinking? What are they talking about? You listen podcasts. I would say that is also one of the things I found that is kind of powerful. Of there are so many content, high quality content available in the Chinese podcasting world, but there's definitely a gap of what is available in the English world right now. And another project I'm also doing with like Asia Society is to be attached to the Asia Society Policy Institute, the Center for Chinese Analysis, and I will be doing a research project around emotions. And nowadays we tend to understand China through geopolitical lens, through like the tech competition lens. But I think it's also important to understand China from the lens of emotion. And in fact, I think that is actually the most important revolution that is happening in China now. It's the inner revolution, how people feel about their everyday life, how people feel about having children, having family, getting married, how they feel about how they want to live their life. And I think that is something I really want to invest and understand better. And my last point is it is because I've been like you said, I think we both share this experience of born and raised in China from a quite modest background, and coming all the way here, and being successful as you are nowadays. And I feel it's such a privilege. It's not an easy journey. Like, I come from a province. I come from a city, a small city in the Chinese province called Guizhou, and I would say, for a bright young person like you who come to Columbia, the kind of tuition fee you spend in order to get to Columbia is probably more than all the salaries that my parents have ever earned in their entire life. And so I think that part of China is also important to mention in this big picture. And so I and I want to actually quote. I think the job of understanding China is a big and ongoing process, and it's a process that I think people like you and me and also everyone in the room we well more or less like be involved. And I want to quote a journalist friend of mine whose name is Zhang Jieping, and he had a great statement of a great phrase of describing this situation. I think like China is a process, and understanding China is also a process. And China is not a fixed entity. It's ongoing. It's dynamic, and each single of us, no matter you're from China or not from China, our participation in telling the story is very important. And both my podcast and the fellowship, through all the channels I have, and also gathering like this, I think we are trying to reach that goal, which is to diversify our understanding of China and the world. Yeah.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the question.
I cannot stop thinking about the two words you said from the very beginning, connection and agency. So very well captured our conversation today. So now I invite our audience members, both in the room and online, to please feel free to raise any questions. Yes. Please speak to the mic if you're in the room. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having us here. I myself is a huge podcast user. Actually, I just checked my listening history. I hit 2,000 hours of listening to podcasts. And it's really interesting that you talked about your relationship as a speaker to audience. I used to feel this sense of intimacy, and I used to think it's only on the audience side. But today you mentioned as a speaker, you feel that way too. So just to step further, I'm really curious about how do you balance the need to be authentic in your expression with the sense of responsibility to not being misleading or simply misrepresent yourself. I'm wondering, how do you balance these two things? Authentic and responsibility.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a great question, and I think one of the interesting about my podcast and actually also a lot of podcasting in China is that often we have a guest, and so we invite like experts on different topics to talk on the podcast. Sometimes I also have episodes only with my co-host that's the moment when we talk a little bit more about, feelings and opinions, and we could be very beachy together and very opinionated, and but then people who listen to those episodes, they know that this is the sort of like the opinion sections. It's like opinion section in a newspaper, but the opinion section in our podcast. And a lot of the time, especially when it comes to topics that concern big like public interest, or when it concerns about like topics that I think really should be like serious factual based conversation, then we do really rely on our guest. And when we try to find those guests, we also try to find them with slightly like different opinions. And I remember, like for instance, Yao was on our podcast a while ago, and when the the abortion law got like revised in the U.S., and we had him and with another scholar to share their really professional opinions of what that means for the U.S. for women's rights. And so I feel we do sort of like make a distinguish of, when it's private, we really make it private and personal. But when it concerns like bigger public issues that we feel we need to serve as a messenger, I'm also very happy to just serve as messenger.
Please.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and sharing. I'm a podcaster myself, so it's really nice to hear that word of encouragement.
Do you mind sharing your name, the name of your podcast?
Yeah, sure. Right now it's primarily in Chinese, but it's called Jinar 和他的朋友. My name's Jinar, and it's just a podcast, or it's on Spotify, and you can see. I just invite my friend as my guest because I love my friend. I think they're interesting, and and that's what I do for fun. And that was something, I think there was something you shared just now about your positionality, right? Like where you come from and versus where you're now, you travel sort of working different capacity globally too, but still trying to reach and bridge that gap between what's been conceived in news, in grand sort of narratives versus the small individual personal narratives in China. And also you mentioned, like with you and your co-host currently also basing globally now. Was there ever a moment you start to reflect, okay, like how should I, being on global position, how should I bridge that gap between like I'm not personally in China, or I mean, regardless of consuming Chinese media, right, have friends, but I'm just curious to hear that thought process, because that's a dilemma I constantly think about, because it's like, okay, like I was born, raised in China, but being remote from there and the voice I'm representing, how should we position that how should we position ourselves with that? I wouldn't say conflicts, but that dilemma, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I've been thinking about this non-stop, I think, ever since I got out of China. So thank you for sharing your own experience. And I think for me, it really took a while to sort of accept or embrace the position I am in right now, which is I don't pretend that I understand China. I don't pretend I still understand what is going on the ground in China. I make trips to China a few times every year to help me still get connected with what's happening there. But I have to, I think, be just be humble of saying that even if I was born and raised here, I'm deeply attached to there, but I don't understand everything that is going on there. And by accepting that fact, it actually made me feel much better. That makes me feel, more open-minded, and also that actually, I think, on the other hand, sort of remove this like China jacket from myself, which allows me to see what is actually happening, the place I am in right now. And so I would say this is like we actually had also make a podcast about it a while ago. We call the situation as the in-betweener, like you are inside, you are from China, but you are not really in China anymore. You are in here, either the US, Europe, Australia, Japan, but you are not really from here. And do you really? But how? Who are you? What are you? And if you don't understand China, then do you understand what's happening here 100%? Probably also not. Like the other day, I was like watching the Super Bowl with my partner at home, and I had to say, I had such a difficult time of getting into that sport, which because I didn't really have all the emotional connection, from my schooling system here. And then the other day I went to karaoke somewhere in downtown Manhattan, which I felt, oh my God, this is really me. Wait, my Chinese friends in New York, and we sing, songs from like Zhou Zilun and Sun Yanzi, and we never really updated our playlist ever since like high school. But that's like so fun, and so I think for me, to start realize, okay, actually there could be a possibility something in between is the liberation. Like you're from there, but you don't entirely belong there. You're living here, but you don't really have to, say, fully integrate, fully remove where you come from. And there is a space in between, and there are a lot of people in that space actually.
I think that's everyone
Yeah.
about us. Yeah. So please, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I'm most interested in who are your most admired role models and why, and your ultimate impact you want to make through your podcast.
Oh,
Thank you.
wow.
I know it's a little bit challenging.
Yeah. Wow, that's really a very challenging question. Yeah, I'm gonna just talk about the one name that just immediately popping up on my mind. I role model will be a little bit like too strong, but he's like someone that I want to maybe at some point being able to be doing what he's doing. It's the stand-up comedian called Trevor Noah. Okay, I'm not alone here. Okay, that's great. So Trevor Noah, he lives in New York, I think. He's a comedian from South Africa, and he was born in apartheid. And I think his mom is a black woman. His father is a Swiss white person in South Africa, and he started being a comedian at a young age, but he gained huge success after coming to the U.S. and made a big contribution during the COVID lockdown. And I don't know if my description does him justice, but I like him. First and foremost, I think a lot of people like him because he's really funny. He has huge like a language talent, linguistic talent. And secondly, I think he really brings in the truly global and critical, always an outsider perspective into a conversation. Before him, I've been watching The Daily Show for a few years, but I never felt I was deeply connected with the show. And not to say, the host was not great, but I just don't see myself in them. But I think after Trevor come into the spot, he, in a way, I think he authorized the Americanness and he probably makes Americans understand themselves better. And then he's like being critical also about his blackness, his South Africanness, Frenchness, and I just wish I could, in a way, to always keep that kind of perspective, always being able to seeing things from an sort of outsider's perspective. On the other hand, I just wish I could be as funny as he is. The ultimate impact I want to make, I think from my podcast, probably I can. I don't know. Is it like I feel like in this like kind of a changing world, at the speed of me, that stop making plans or visions for like more than like 2-3 years, and so I would just probably say in the coming a few years, I wish I wanna my podcast to reach out to audiences that are not so that are in living in like mainland China, that are no like traditional or typical podcast audiences. Like one of the thing that I felt I was very touched by was a letter a while ago from a listener. He was he started listening to our podcast when he was a mid school student, and that was like before probably he learned how to use VPN, be aware of what is going on in the world, that he had access to our podcast. And I think that's something that made me quite proud compared to, like numbers and all that. I think that one single reach out made me feel, okay, actually it is meaningful to keep engaging and keep operating in China, because then you have the chance to reach out to audiences that are often not so easily reached out to. And then I feel like if I concretely think about what is the thing I want to keep doing for the coming a few years, I think that's probably the direction I really want to work on. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for sharing with us. I'm also a social media content creator myself, but I've never tried podcast, but I really like it. I think there's are definitely some strength within the medium, like the intimacy you mentioned, and also they're harder to get censored compared to a traditional medium. But also, I have some questions about the future. I guess the first one is, sorry, I have a lot of questions. I'll try to make it short.
Okay.
The first question is about the language, because I think the podcast seems to have a natural language barrier, unlike the written text. They're much harder to translate and circulate across languages. So even though AI might make this easier in future, but I also noticed that the English podcast and Chinese podcasts have a very different ecosystem because of the language. So do you think this language barrier limits, does it limit the cross-cultural exchange, or do you see the podcast eventually becoming a more global thing despite that?
I actually think so. If you ask the question, yeah, maybe 5 years ago, I think you probably would have a different answer. But I think nowadays, despite all the limitation that AI is having, I think it's really providing a very powerful tool for different language users to understand each other, at least from the technical level. But on the other hand, I always I still like always believe that there is something that is so irreplaceable in one's mother language. And so it's not like, can we create the Weirdo Podcast in English with the tool of AI, and can we, translate and doing the voiceover and everything, and will that be the same in English? No, it won't be the same. And I think there are very like specific kind of very specific language, the texture in the language, the tones, and the length of the words, the phrase, and it carries on so much emotion, especially in the medium of podcast. So I feel the technology on the one hand can help us bridge a lot of language gap and cultural gap, but on the other hand, speaking like podcast as a medium in particular, I always believe the authenticity in it, that is not so easily replaced or easily being created in a different language.
Thank you. Sorry, I have another question.
Yeah, sure.
Do you think that the podcast growth will hit a ceiling, or is it like will continue? Because I've seen a very different kind of growth. My high school English teacher, she quit her job and started podcast like 3 years ago, and now she accumulated I think over 1 million across platforms. She's now like one of the top tier the true crime podcast. But she also told me that her listeners, they are not the fan of the podcast medium, but just having the interest of listening to the true crime. So do you think, well, that kind of growth really translate to the industry, like become like loyal, how do you say, like loyal subscribers in that way?
Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so speaking from our own podcast, I think like we probably have a very different strategy, which is like the growth is not actually not like our number one goal. And I think but I understand there are actually a lot of podcasters or content creators who will prioritize like growth as the priority, and I see a lot of cross-medium growth as well happening in the podcasting in China. One example, in some recent like the podcast reports I read, one of the main drive of the growth of podcast subscription actually comes from Xiaohongshu, from the little red note, and it come from that platform because some listeners like accidentally shared some feelings or comments on Xiaohongshu, and then it click with the algorithm in Xiaohongshu, and then all of a sudden that post get like thousands of likes, and then that converted back to the growth of podcast. And I think that is actually a really new thing happening in China in 2025, because before that, I would consider the podcast growth as some sort of more independent, organic, and authentic, because it has this like decentralized feature, and it doesn't rely on other social media platform that much. But I think 2025 was really a year that I start realizing, oh, okay, actually the Chinese podcasting world is actually different from the American one or the English one, because the Chinese podcasting is now also become another form of platformization. It just become, like, so then like the cross platforms conversion become important. So if you ask me, do I see the podcast growth is reaching its ceiling? I would say it's still far from reaching the feeling the ceiling. Especially now, lots of people also put it on YouTube, and is that still a podcast, or is it just like regular video talk program? I think the boundary is getting a little bit more blur and ambiguous, but the growth will continue. Yeah.
I think we are running out of time. So I think we should stop here. And for those of you who want to continue the dialogue afterwards, you're welcome to. And those of you who raised a question, please come get one of these beautiful hats.
Yes,
不合时宜, the Weirdo Podcast. Thank you so much, Qin. Thank you, everyone, in person and online.
Thank you so much for Professor Gao and also for Hiba and also the other colleagues who are helping with the events. Really, really thank you for organizing the amazing program.
Thank you.